1945. The war was over. But for the men sitting behind barbed wire fences under the scorching Pacific sun, peace felt like a word they were not allowed to touch. Japanese prisoners of war sat in silence, their uniforms torn, their faces hollowed by months of hunger and fear. Dust floated through the air, glimmering like ash over the wooden tables lined up in the center of the U.S. camp. American soldiers moved quietly, carrying metal trays that clattered faintly in the still morning. No one spoke. The Japanese POWs sat with their heads lowered, hands trembling, unsure of what awaited them. For years, they had been told that capture meant dishonor, that Americans were monsters who would make them suffer. But what they saw that morning shattered everything they thought they knew. Steam rose from bowls of soup, thick, golden broth filled with vegetables and rice. There was bread, fresh fruit, even coffee. The smell alone was enough to stir memories of home, of wives and mothers, of peaceful mornings long before the war. Their eyes filled with tears before the first bite was even taken. It wasn't the food itself. It was the mercy it represented. In that moment, the prisoners realized something deeper, that compassion can appear even in the ruins of war, and that sometimes the greatest victory is the one fought within the heart. The table stood between them like a fragile bridge, a narrow stretch of wood that somehow carried the weight of two broken nations. On one side sat the men who had once sworn to die before surrender. On the other stood the ones who had defeated them. The air was heavy with silence, thick enough to feel on the tongue. Even the wind seemed to hesitate as it drifted through the camp, carrying the faint smell of boiled vegetables and fresh bread. It was the scent of something they had forgotten. Normalcy. The Japanese prisoners sat in long rows, their bodies stiff and hollowed by exhaustion. Their uniforms were more rags than fabric now, torn, sun-faded, caked with the dust of defeat. Their boots were split at the seams, their caps long gone. Some men had no shoes at all, their feet blistered and wrapped in bits of cloth. Their faces were gaunt, eyes sunken deep beneath brows darkened by grime. Yet it wasn't hunger that froze them in place. It was confusion. Before them, on the rough tables, sat metal trays lined with steaming food. Soup. Real soup. Not the thin, tasteless water they had been given in the last weeks of the war, but thick, golden broth that shimmered with fat and flavor. Pieces of vegetables floated in it, carrots, potatoes, onions, and the faint trace of rice gathered at the bottom. There were slices of bread beside it, soft and uneven, clearly handmade, and in small tin cups a dark liquid still steaming coffee. For a moment no one dared move. The prisoners looked at one another uncertain. Some thought it might be a trick, a test of obedience. Others simply couldn't comprehend why their captors would feed them so well. To them, defeat had always meant shame. Captivity meant torment. Their officers had told them the Americans would treat them like animals, that death was preferable to capture. And yet, here they sat, being offered mercy on a table of wood. An older prisoner near the end of the row stared at his reflection in the bowl, distorted, ghostly. He remembered his wife's kitchen in Kyoto, the way steam would rise from the pot as she stirred miso soup in the morning. He remembered his little boy, barely old enough to hold chopsticks, waiting impatiently beside him. For a fleeting second, that memory and the bowl before him seemed to merge, and the line between the past and the present blurred into something painfully human. His hand trembled as he reached forward. The American soldier standing across from him said nothing. He was young, barely in his 20s. his face tanned from weeks under the island sun. The rifle slung across his shoulder looked too heavy for the moment. His eyes met the prisoner's for just an instant, and in that quiet, something unspoken passed between them. The soldier gave a small nod, not a command, not permission, just acknowledgement. The old man lifted the bowl, hesitated, then took a sip. The warmth spread through his chest like fire. It wasn't just the taste. It was the realization that someone had given it to him not out of cruelty, but out of compassion. He set the bowl down slowly, his lips trembling. The others watched him closely. When he didn't fall ill, when the silence didn't shatter into violence, one by one the others began to move. Bowls lifted, spoons stirred, and for the first time since their capture, the camp filled not with fear, but with the faint, fragile sound of eating. The Americans didn't interfere. Some leaned against the fence, arms folded, watching quietly. Others pretended to busy themselves with supplies, but their eyes betrayed a kind of solemn attentiveness. They knew what this meal meant. The war was over, but its ghost still lingered in every stare, every gesture. Feeding the enemy was not an act of victory. It was an act of reconciliation, and reconciliation always came with silence. One soldier shifted his cap, glancing over the table. The faces he saw were no longer the faces of enemies. They were faces of men who had seen too much, lost too much, endured too much. He thought of the friends he'd buried in foreign soil, of the smell of gunpowder that still haunted his dreams. And now, across a table stained with soup and dust, he saw those same emotions mirrored in the eyes of the defeated. It felt strange, almost unbearable, that after everything, compassion could still exist between them. The prisoners began to eat slowly, carefully, as though afraid the food might vanish if they moved too fast. Some muttered silent prayers. Others simply stared at their bowls between bites, trying to make sense of the moment. One young prisoner broke down quietly, his shoulders shaking. The man beside him placed a hand on his back. No words, just a gesture that said what neither could voice. There were no speeches, no forgiveness exchanged in words. The act itself was enough. The table, rough, weathered, covered with scars, became a silent witness to something purer than victory. It was a moment when humanity briefly stepped out from behind the shadows of war and reminded them what it meant to be alive. Beyond the camp's barbed wire, the world was moving on. Trucks rumbled on distant roads, carrying soldiers home. Flags fluttered over ruined cities. Radio broadcasts spoke of peace treaties and rebuilding. But inside that camp, time seemed to slow. Every spoonful of soup, every tear that slipped silently down a face, carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. The American cook, standing near the makeshift kitchen, watched the scene unfold. He had stirred those pots himself, sweating over the fire since dawn. He wasn't a man of politics or strategy. He only knew hunger, and he knew what it did to a man. When he saw the prisoners eating, saw their faces soften and their posture ease, he turned away, pretending to adjust the firewood. He didn't want anyone to see his eyes glisten. The Japanese officer, who once commanded these men in battle, sat quietly among them. His posture was still erect, his dignity still intact, but his heart was breaking. This was not how he imagined surrender. Yet, watching his men eat, watching them regain the faintest glimmer of strength, he realized this was not humiliation. It was release. They were no longer fighting for survival, they were simply existing. A bird landed on the fence post nearby, chirping once before flying off again. The sound, brief and delicate, seemed to mark the end of something, The air grew softer. The camp, once echoing with orders and marching boots, felt strangely peaceful. The only movements were slow and human, spoons stirring, heads bowing, shoulders easing from tension. The American soldier from before shifted his stance, resting his rifle against the fence. He crouched for a moment, watching the older man who had first taken a sip. Their eyes met again, and this time the soldier managed a faint smile. The old man, in return, gave a small bow, the slightest tilt of the head, but heavy with meaning. In that simple gesture, centuries of pride and conflict folded into mutual respect. Somewhere far beyond that island, families were waiting. Mothers who didn't know their sons were still alive, wives who still lit candles at night, hoping for a miracle. None of them would ever know about this table, about this meal, about the quiet exchange that took place in a forgotten camp at the edge of the Pacific. History would remember the battles, the generals, the treaties, but not this. And yet, this was the kind of moment that truly healed what war had broken. The soup cooled, the plates emptied, but no one rushed to leave. The prisoners sat with their bowls in their hands, holding them as if afraid to let go. The warmth that had spread through their bodies lingered long after the last drop was gone. One man closed his eyes and whispered something. Maybe a thank you, maybe a prayer. It didn't matter in what language it was spoken. The meaning was universal. For a while no one moved. Even the guards stood still, as though breaking the stillness might undo what had just occurred. The camp, once divided by fear, felt united in quiet reverence. It wasn't joy they felt, not yet. But it was something gentler, something long forgotten. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the tables, a soft breeze moved through the camp, stirring the edges of the soldiers' uniforms and the prisoners' torn sleeves alike. Dust lifted from the ground, catching the light, swirling above the bowls like ghosts set free. At that moment no one was thinking of flags or nations or orders. There were only men, weary, scarred, human, sharing the simplest of things, a meal. When the first man lifted his spoon, the movement was almost invisible, yet every eye caught it. The soft clink of metal against the bowl broke the spell of silence that had blanketed the camp. For a moment, all motion stopped. Soldiers, prisoners, even the wind seemed to wait. The spoon trembled slightly in his hand as he brought it closer to his mouth, the steam curling upward like a ghost. Then he took the first sip. It was a small act, almost insignificant in the vast wreckage of war, yet it carried the weight of everything they had lost. The broth touched his tongue, warm, rich, familiar. His throat tightened. It wasn't the food itself that struck him, but the emotion buried within it. It tasted of something he thought was gone forever. Kindness. He swallowed slowly, letting the warmth spread down to his stomach. It had been months since anything had felt so real. The others watched him closely, and when he didn't collapse, when no cruelty followed, something inside them broke free. One by one they followed, spoons lifted, heads bowed. The sound of quiet eating filled the camp, the clinking of metal, the faint rustle of fabric, the sound of men tasting humanity again. The air changed. A stillness remained, but it was no longer heavy. It was fragile, sacred. Some men bowed their heads before the first bite, whispering the name of a god they hadn't spoken to since the beginning of the war. Others sat frozen after the first mouthful, staring into their bowls as tears slipped down their cheeks. There was a man in the middle row, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the spoon. His name was lost to the war now, but once he had been a schoolteacher. He had taught children how to write poetry before the empire called him to serve. As he lifted the soup to his lips, he remembered his classroom, the laughter of his students, the smell of chalk and ink. The taste of broth became the bridge between what he was and what the war had made him. The tears came quietly, sliding down his dirt-covered face and falling into the soup, vanishing into its surface like rain on a calm sea. Across the table, another man froze mid-bite. He had spent weeks believing he was already dead. He had survived bombings, starvation, and surrender, but never had he felt the ache that now spread through his chest. The act of being fed by the enemy. It was unbearable and beautiful all at once. He looked up, and his gaze met the eyes of an American soldier standing nearby. The soldier's face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes held something unexpected, understanding. That moment, that silent meeting of gazes, carried more meaning than any words could. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was the recognition of shared suffering, an acknowledgement that pain had no flag. A few prisoners began to weep openly now, their quiet sobs rippling through the group like wind through grass. One young soldier, barely more than a boy, tried to hide his face in his hands, but his body betrayed him, shaking uncontrollably. The man beside him reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Somewhere near the edge of the camp, an American officer watched the scene unfold. He had seen too much of the war's ugliness to believe in sentimentality. Yet as he watched his men serve food to their former enemies, something in him softened. He thought of his own brother, who never came home from the Pacific, and wondered what it would have looked like if the roles had been reversed. If it were his brother sitting there, starved and hollow, trembling over a bowl of soup, would someone have shown him mercy? The prisoners continued to eat in silence. The sound of spoons scraping bowls became almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat slowly returning to life. One man broke a piece of bread in half and set it gently beside his neighbor's tray, offering it without a word. Another prisoner, too weak to lift his own bowl, was quietly helped by the man sitting next to him. The line that had once divided captor and captive began to fade, replaced by something wordless, deeply human. The American soldiers remained mostly still. Some shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to behave. They had seen the enemy up close now, not through the smoke of battle, but through the quiet aftermath. These weren't faceless soldiers anymore. They were men who looked just as tired, just as lost. One private lowered his gaze, trying to hide the way his throat tightened. He had fought at Saipan and lost friends to men wearing this same uniform. Yet watching them eat, seeing their frailty, he felt something that confused him, pity, even respect. The sun rose higher, casting long beams of gold through the open field. The light caught on the edges of tin cups and bowls, glinting like the remnants of some forgotten ritual. The prisoners' faces, streaked with dirt and tears, seemed to soften in the warmth. The soup, though simple, carried meaning far greater than its ingredients. It was proof that cruelty could be undone, even briefly, by compassion. A translator, one of the few who understood both languages, stood at the far end of the line, his notebook clutched to his chest. He had been instructed to record any incidents, disobedience, refusal, violence. There was none. What he witnessed instead, he would later describe in a quiet report. The prisoners showed gratitude without words. Many cried while eating, no disturbances, only silence. As the minutes passed, That silence deepened, not out of fear, but reverence. The camp's noises, the murmuring of soldiers, the rustle of flags, the buzz of insects, all seemed distant, almost respectful of the moment unfolding. A strange peace had settled over the place where war had once spoken loudest. A Japanese medic among the prisoners looked up from his bowl. He had treated dying comrades on muddy battlefields, often with nothing more than rags and faith. He had watched too many men starve. Now, he saw his fellow soldiers being nourished, not punished, not mocked, but given something to live for, if only for a day. He whispered to himself, perhaps this, too, is a kind of healing. The tears came not because of the food, but because of what it represented. For months, they had been told that Americans were brutal, that capture meant humiliation. Yet in this act there was no mockery, only quiet decency. It defied everything they had been taught, everything they had prepared themselves for. It reminded them that even in war, men were capable of kindness that transcended ideology. A few of the younger soldiers, unsure of how to express what they felt, placed their bowls down after a few bites. They folded their hands and bowed their heads. Not in prayer, not exactly. It was a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement. The American soldiers who saw it didn't know what it meant, but they felt it. One of them instinctively removed his cap and stood straighter. For a while, the camp seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind moved gently now, carrying the faint scent of soup and dust through the fences. In the distance, the ocean could be heard faintly, a slow, rhythmic pulse against the shore. That sound, timeless and indifferent, seemed to echo the quiet rhythm of spoons scraping bowls, men breathing, hearts remembering how to feel again. It was not forgiveness that filled the air, nor was it reconciliation. It was something simpler, recognition. The prisoners saw in their captors not demons, but human beings. And the Americans saw in the defeated not monsters, but reflections of themselves, stripped of armor and anger. In that fragile recognition, the wall between them cracked. After the last mouthfuls were taken, the men didn't immediately move. They sat still, hands resting on empty bowls, eyes fixed on nothing. The warmth of the soup lingered in their bellies, spreading outward like a quiet pulse of life. Some smiled faintly, the first real smile in months. Others simply wept again, silently, as though purging something that had been buried too long. One American soldier, the same young man from earlier, took a hesitant step forward. He carried a small canteen in his hand, half full of coffee. Without speaking, he placed it on the table beside one of the prisoners who looked too weak to move. The prisoner looked up, startled, then bowed deeply. The soldier nodded once and stepped back. That tiny act, unnoticed by most, carried more meaning than any command could. The camp's commanding officer finally spoke, his voice calm but distant. "Let them finish," he said to his men. "No rush." It was the simplest of orders, but in its tone was something deeper, respect. The prisoners ate until the bowls were empty, until every drop of broth was gone. A few carefully wiped their bowls clean with pieces of bread, unwilling to waste a trace. When the last bite was taken, they sat quietly, hands folded in front of them, waiting. One older prisoner looked around at his men. He saw their faces, tired, lined, but alive. He saw the color returning to their cheeks, the faint shimmer of hope in their eyes. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that survival was not shame. He whispered softly in Japanese, "We are still human." The American guards began collecting the bowls, moving slowly, almost reverently. The clatter of metal echoed gently across the field, mingling with the distant cry of a bird. The sun had climbed high now, bathing the camp in white light. Shadows disappeared. For one fleeting morning, war felt far away. Razdat had fallen, quiet, unnoticed, soaked into the dry earth beneath the tables. No one spoke of them, but they remained as much a part of the landscape as the footprints and the dust. And in those tears lived something neither side could destroy: the fragile, unspoken truth that mercy can exist even in the aftermath of hatred. When the prisoners were finally led back to their barracks, they walked differently, slower, quieter, but with a strange dignity that hadn't been there before. They didn't look like defeated men anymore. They looked like survivors. And the Americans who watched them go felt something shift inside themselves too. A small, wordless understanding that victory without compassion was just another kind of loss. Long after the prisoners disappeared behind the fences, the tables remained, stained with soup and sunlight. The bowls stacked neatly, the spoons drying in the heat. The camp slowly returned to its rhythm. Orders shouted, boots crunching in the dirt. But somewhere beneath it all lingered the ghost of that quiet moment. The young soldier who had offered his coffee lingered near the fence, watching the path where the prisoners had walked. He took off his cap, rubbed his eyes, and whispered something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe just a sigh. Then he turned and walked away, leaving behind the silence, the dust, and the memory of a morning when enemies became men again. That day settled into memory like a photograph left too long in the sun, its colors fading, its edges curling, but its emotion forever preserved. The war had ended, but the souls of the men in that camp were still trapped somewhere between the past and the promise of peace. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in soft strokes of gold and amber, and the faint breeze carried with it the smells of earth, smoke, and something new, something clean. The tables stood in the open field, their surfaces rough and splintered, scarred by weather and use. Yet, for the first time, they looked almost beautiful. They had served as altars to an unspoken truth that even after the cruelest of wars, men could still share bread without hatred. The Japanese prisoners remained seated long after the meal had ended. Their bowls were empty now, the last traces of soup drying into faint golden stains. No one spoke. Words felt too small for what they had just experienced. The warmth of the food lingered in their bodies, and the memory of the moment lingered in their hearts. They stared at the wooden tables as if afraid that, by standing, they might lose the fragile peace that had settled among them. The American guards didn't rush them. They stood a short distance away, quiet and respectful. The tension that once hung between them had softened, replaced by something gentler, a kind of shared fatigue. These men, both captor and captive, had seen too much death to mistake this stillness for weakness. It was mercy, rare and quiet, and it demanded reverence. The sky above the camp began to change. The light turned bronze, and the long shadows of the men stretched across the dirt like ghosts of their former selves. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire fence, a radio played faintly, an American broadcast, its signal weak, the music scratchy and distant. It was a slow tune, something sentimental. And though none of the prisoners could understand the lyrics, they understood the emotion. The melody carried across the air like a lullaby to a world trying to remember how to breathe again. The prisoners' eyes lifted to the horizon. Beyond the wire, the land rolled gently toward the sea, glowing under the fading sun. For the first time in months, Some of them allowed themselves to look beyond the fence, not with longing or despair, but with a quiet sense of possibility. The war had stolen everything from them, their pride, their country, their comrades. But in that single act of compassion, they had rediscovered the faintest glimmer of their own humanity. An American soldier leaning against a post watched them silently. His rifle hung loosely from his shoulder now, his posture relaxed. He thought of how, not long ago, these same men would have been his enemies on the battlefield, targets in his rifle's scope, silhouettes against the jungle's smoke. But now, seeing them sit there, weary and thin, he felt none of the rage that had once driven him. Instead, he felt a kind of ache, an understanding that no victory could erase the cost of what had been lost. The young soldier lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, and exhaled into the dimming light. The smoke curled upward, mixing with the warm evening air. He thought about home, about the letter he carried folded in his pocket. One he had read so many times that the paper had gone soft. His mother had written it during the final months of the war, when the outcome was still uncertain. She had said, "Remember, son, the enemy is human too. If you ever forget that, the war will have won something far worse than land." He hadn't understood it then. But now, watching these men bow their heads over empty bowls, he finally did. The Japanese officer seated among his men felt the same realization in his chest, though he couldn't have put it into words. For years, he had trained himself to believe in the code of absolute loyalty, to the emperor, to honor, to death. Surrender was shame, mercy was weakness. Yet the warmth that still lingered in his stomach contradicted everything he had been taught. The food, the silence, the unexpected kindness, it all whispered of a truth he could no longer ignore. War had lied to them all. He looked around at his men, their faces illuminated by the last light of day. Some sat with their eyes closed, others stared into the distance, lost in thought. He realized they were not soldiers anymore. They were simply human beings, stripped of symbols and slogans. The war had taken everything that made them proud, but it had left behind something deeper: humility. A few of the prisoners began to hum softly, an old Japanese melody, slow and mournful, carried by tired voices. The sound was fragile at first, barely audible. But as others joined, it grew stronger, filling the camp with a haunting beauty. The Americans nearby turned their heads, listening. None of them understood the words, but they felt the sorrow in the melody, the yearning, the regret, the quiet surrender.